Welcome to the Effortless Swimming podcast. My guest today is Jeff Grace from Swim Specific Yoga. So Jeff, first of all, welcome to the podcast and welcome back because I've had you on before. So how have you been over the last probably 2 years since we last spoke, I reckon?
Yeah, been great. It's been a journey, I think, as it has been for everybody. An interesting one, but yeah, no, things have been great.
And we were talking before the call about there's been a big shift, obviously, online, which everyone knows about. And we're also talking about a swimmer that I used to coach who started doing your online yoga. I think you said November or December last year, and she emailed you just recently and said, "I can tell you that this works because I just had a swim meet and my times were a lot better than they were in the past." So what I want to chat about today is how people can just move better as swimmers, because from my perspective, people, when they come to clinics, majority of them are in their 40s to 50s, I'd say most of them. And what we see is that their range of motion is very limited, particularly through the hips, with a lot of triathletes sitting down and riding and running and sitting at a desk. Like, the range of motion through the hips is very poor. And that just leads to a whole host of issues that create drag. And so if people can just learn to move a bit better and be a bit more aware of what their body's doing through certain phases of the stroke by using something like yoga, it can have such a big impact on your swimming. And if you combine that with the technical side that I teach, I think it's just a very powerful combination to really make huge changes in your swimming. And so you've worked with swimmers for a long time with yoga, and I'm sure you've seen these sorts of things time and time again.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I can agree with you more when you talk about master swimmers. I mean, just everything that's involved in our daily lives that teach us how not to move. And I've found, because I come from the swim coaching background and coming at it and trying to discover the best ways to do dry land and testing out different modalities, I've just found that yoga is such an all-encompassing modality. It has the body awareness element to it. When you're talking the overall movement, right? I love that you put that in there and not just mobility, because when you look at it, you've got the body awareness, overall awareness when we're talking about breath, then you've got the strength element, and you've got a rhythm element to it. So you've got and then you've got the mental component to it. So you've got so many different aspects that yoga hits on. And when you're talking about an adult athlete, you've got a whole bunch of years of motor patterns and habits that sometimes need to first bring awareness to, and to be able to start to get them to move in the way that you want them to be efficient in the water, and to be, let's face it, for some people, just comfortable in the water.
I mean, one of the things that I've found most interesting in the last couple of years is that what people think they're doing in the stroke is obviously a lot different than what's actually happening. But more than anywhere, it's out in front of the head. So the overhead movements from the entry to the reach and the catch, like, it's just that the proprioception there is very, very poor, as well as other parts of the body, but particularly out in front of the head. Is that something that you've seen in the yoga that you do? And I know it's like a very small part of it is overhead movements, but I'm just curious whether that's something that you've seen with the guys that you work with.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, that is one of the major things that when designing programs that are specifically for swimmers that you have to look at, or you have to really address and focus on. Because how often are we actually putting load or doing precise movements in our everyday lives in an overhead way, right? And in fact, the majority of what we're doing is restricting all of that. So when you look at not only, a typical swimmer's posture of that rounded shoulder posture, but that's just for almost anyone who is not doing a job that takes an extreme amount of movement, right? Anyone who's at a desk for any period of time. But then also when you look at what you're talking about with triathletes, what are you doing when you're on a bike, right? So really getting that body awareness with the overhead movement is a huge aspect. And I think when you look at it, you look at the shoulder mobility, and then you look at the thoracic spine mobility. Those are the two biggest areas that affect that. And then just plain and simply getting an understanding of moving in different ways in that overhead, with those overhead positions. But yes, it is something that I see a lot of.
Yeah, and particularly that thoracic mobility. So just before we started this podcast, I was doing analysis videos for our members, and one of the swimmers he's just joined, we're working on not over rotating through the shoulders and through the hips, because in both directions he's going too far. Legs are splaying out, and it's impacting his catch as well. And so one of the things I suggested was probably going to have to start looking at just better thoracic mobility, like the side to side thoracic movement. And obviously it's something that you do a lot in yoga. And one of the tests that we used to do at clinics when we were doing this sort of testing was we'd get them to sit on the edge of a chair, have their knees, have their feet together, their legs together, and then we'd get them to have their hands out in front, put the palms together, and get them to rotate as far as they could without letting the arms bend, without letting the knees come apart. And most people couldn't get past about 45 degrees, if 90 degrees is all the way to the side. But when they're looking at elite swimmers, they want them to be able to get to that 90-degree range. Otherwise, they'll look at some corrective exercises to help it. But yeah, it was amazing how tight people are side to side. And so if you are tight there, it's going to cause your hips to rotate too far along with that shoulder rotation. And that's going to cause the legs to splay and a whole bunch of other things. So what sort of things can people do to help that? And what sort of time period are people looking at to be able to see even a minor improvement in it?
I think first off, when you look at, I'm just going to address the time period aspect first. I think when you look at that, just bringing the awareness to what's going on in that area can create a very immediate improvement, right? Because I don't think very many people, like if you have people simply just sit there and try that movement, just an awareness of how to move through that area, how to do that movement sitting in a chair. I'm sure that when you did that once with someone and then got them to do it a second time, you'd probably already see just from them recognizing the pattern that they'd have to go through. So by doing the body awareness aspect of it, or the body awareness aspect of the movement around the thoracic spine, I think you can see some very immediate change on that. Stabilization of the hips, I think, is something that's really important, because when people start working on thoracic spine stuff, so there's two movements that I like to, there's three big ones when you're looking at that rotation through the thoracic spine that I like to use. One is lying down, and that's a little bit more where you can keep the hips a little bit more, can be stabilized easier and have better body awareness around that. But the other two, one's in a lunging position where you then keep one hand on the ground and then you're rotating through with the other arm. So I've got my right leg forward, I got my left leg back, I'll have my left hand down, and then I'll open up with my right arm. Hopefully that all made sense. Yep. But the first thing there is teaching people how to stabilize through their hips, because one of the first things you see is people will go to do that thoracic twist, and they'll allow their hips to just go with it because they feel like, oh, I'm getting more mobility, but actually all you're doing is you're letting your pelvis move. So this is where that body awareness aspect comes in. So learning how to stabilize the pelvis and then actually moving through the thoracic spine itself, which is something you talked about with doing that chair test. And I think that's one of the things that's most important when people are thinking about doing poses, doing movements, whatever it is to increase thoracic spine mobility, is you've got to understand, or you've got to make sure that you are actually moving through your thoracic spine and you're not just letting your pelvis shift side to side to actually feel like you're moving through your thoracic spine.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the swimmers that I've started working with online was he was watching a Dave Scott video, the triathlon coach, and he was talking about stable hips. And the concept that he had in his mind that he had to do for his stroke was like not rotate the hips at all. But obviously that's not the case. We need to rotate the hips. They shouldn't stay completely flat. But one of the things Dave Scott talked about was like, think of a coffee cup on your hips. Like you don't want that to spill, but whether or not you use that analogy or not, like maybe that keeps the hips a little bit too still. But yes, we need to rotate it a little bit. But if you go too far and they're unstable and we've bent through the hips and the waist, like there's just very little connection that's going all the way to the extremities from out the front with the catch and so on. So I think with that ability to be controlled and controlled through the hips, it makes such a difference. And the way that I've sort of conceptualized it is, it's like your hips are kind of it's like they're hydraulics. You think of that like side to side movement. We need that control through there to be able to connect up the power from the catch and so on. Whereas if they're just like, I don't know, I haven't thought of the other side of that, but I think of them being on hydraulics with this fairly stable and controlled movement through the freestyle stroke.
Well, I'm gonna give you credit for something that I use all the time in my coaching, which is the rock knot roll, right? And having
I've got to give credit there as well, because I didn't actually come up with that one. So that was Carlin Pipe. So I'll pay that one forward with her. So I think it's a great one. Yeah, rock knot roll.
It's awesome. I think it really gets the message across, right? Because the over rotation thing it's huge. And so finding that middle ground between flat swimming, which is obviously a big problem, and then over rotating. And I think that simple saying of rock knot roll is huge. One of the things that you're saying there that I loved was, and talk about combining, but is the cross body connection. So that connection of, the right hand and the left foot, and starting to understand that connection and control through the core, because that's going to help through your rotation. So when you were asking me some of the things you can do to help with the thoracic rotation, and then thinking about overhead movement, but going from kind of a tabletop position, working on your bird dog pose. So that's where you're raising right leg, left arm, but really having the awareness and the control where, once again, when people do that pose or that exercise, so often they'll think they have to get their leg as high as they possibly can. And what that does is, once again, that shifts the pelvis, right? And learning the control through the core across the body, and learning that control of the pelvis, and getting that really set in, and then going and doing a thread the needle movement. So where you're bringing whichever arm you're using, right arm up and out to the side, or even having the hand back behind the head, which I think isolates through the thoracic spine even a little bit more. And combining that with kind of that cross-body connection is huge for developing strong freestyle in those two elements that you were three elements, I guess, that you were talking about: the control of the rotation, the thoracic spine mobility, and then the awareness of overhead movement.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've seen sort of swimmers move to when it comes to it, whether it's drills in the water or exercises like this, is two reasons why they might not do them. Is one, they're just like, oh, it's a waste of my time, it's not going to help, I just want to get in there and train more. Or the other thing that they do, they're like, all right, I'm going to do it, but I'm just going to rush it, and they go through the movement in a really poor way. And I've done 2 videos recently on Lionel Sanders, and then one on a guy, Sam Long, so 2 professional triathletes. And what I've really enjoyed watching their YouTube series on is they're both not great swimmers. They aren't front pack, but in their journey to get front pack, they've had to change the way that they think about swimming. They're not going to the pool to get fitter, at least not straight away. They've got to go to the pool, and their focus is on technique and slowing it down and being really aware of the movements that they're making in the water, because they are some of the fittest guys on the planet. But the thing that's stopping them from getting quicker is their form and their movement. And so I think it's very similar to it's like how you perform drills is much more important than how many drills you do. Like the purpose of the drills is we want to make sure that we do them right. And it's just very easy to brush through them without actually thinking of what's the purpose behind it. And when I'm running clinics, like people, most people are doing the drills wrong to start with. And so I'm correcting them all the time. And then same thing with these movements out of the water. If you think of that bird dog position, if I've ever taken people through it, most people, their foot's up really high, their arms like not up at shoulder height, it's too low. And so if you can just get them to become aware of this stuff, then, and they can change it, maybe they're looking watching themselves in a mirror, and they can become more aware of where they're at. It's that stuff that will translate into the pool 100% of the time, because it's much easier to change the stuff out of the pool than in the pool. So I think it's a really good place to start.
Yeah, and I think I've had a good number of conversations with coaches, especially when talking about body awareness out of the water and body awareness in the water, right? Because let's face it, completely different environments, right? When you're looking at gravity versus buoyancy and the way that your body feels in each of those two environments. But what I always come back to is the more aware you are of what you're doing with your body anywhere, you're going to be able to make adjustments, right? So the more understanding you have of how to engage and how to relax, you're going to be able to do that out of the water. You're going to be able to do it in the water, right? Because it's the understanding of that activation and relaxation, which is what actually gives us the ability to create the movement that we desire to have.
That's good. Activation and relaxation. It's a good way of thinking about what I try and talk a lot about. It's like when we're swimming, we want to have the least amount of tension possible, like just enough to hold the shape in the water. Any more, and it's wasted. And that's a very hard thing to do. That's kind of mastery of your swimming when you can get to that point, because a new swimmer is going to be probably quite aggressive with the stroke or very tense. But it's those elite swimmers that you see just gliding up and down the pool that have really got that balance in place of activation and relaxation. And is there something that you have done or you've seen swimmers do through the yoga to help them be able to get to that place?
That's a huge thing. I know, I believe is in our first conversation, I brought up the saying that I do really like to use, which is effortless effort, right? And being able to have that sense of, Bill Sweetenham got brought into my mind when you talked about the drills and him saying, doing a drill 99% right is 100% wrong. And then he also has the talk of easy speed. And I really think that that's one of the biggest things that I've seen people be able to take from the mat into the water, is that understanding of allowing, not forcing, of finding flow within their movement, finding rhythm within their movement, and understanding when you're in a pose and you're in a pose for whether it be 2 breaths, 10 breaths, but how to actually make subtle adjustments to be able to create that proper activation in the muscles you need to hold the pose, hold the shape, and then be able to relax everything else around it. So it's exactly what you're talking about in the water. So I really feel that we can teach that on the mat in a very effective way to be able to take that in the water. Number one is that the communication of how you're able to do that can be consistent and really give a person a lot of feedback while they're in a pose. And then the awareness aspect is built into yoga, where sometimes, for us as swimmers, we like to hammer up and down the pool, right? And there's not always the greatest awareness. And that awareness piece is naturally built into yoga when it comes to breath, right? So you have to have that when you're doing a yoga practice and doing it in a very intentional way. You've got that awareness. That increased awareness then allows you to understand that activation and that relaxation. And it's brought back into the actual practice where you're very much encouraged to find that in each one of the movements or each one of the poses that you're doing. So once again, when you can find that on the mat, I truly have seen that you can find that in the water.
Yeah, that's right. The more you can do it in other environments, the more you can do it in the pool. And that's something that I've been focused quite a bit on with my surfing lately. It's like I moved down to the coast, I'm surfing pretty much every day. And when the surf gets big, like I'm wanting to get out there and be able to get as comfortable as possible in the bigger waves. And I was listening to this surfing podcast of a surf coach who I think is really good. He's great with analogies. And I think he coaches in a similar way that I feel like I coach. And so I get a lot from it, and I actually translate it into my own swim coaching. And one of the things he talked about was like if you're going out in big surf, a lot of people will be panicked. And so they're paddling out and they're spending all their energy trying to get out the back and get past the waves. But that water that the waves is carrying through, it's eventually got to have to sort of come back out to sea, and it's got to calm down. And so if you spend all of your energy trying to get out there, by the time you're out there, you're more panicked and you're not going to be able to relax. So even if the surf's big, it's like, just take your time paddling out. And then when the waves are coming in, I was out on a pretty big day, probably the biggest day I've been out in like ever. This was a couple of weeks ago. And I was paddling into, some waves, and like, I was just focused on my breathing and just trying to relax the whole time. The takeoff is easier, the drop and then the bottom turn heaps easier. And then you just surf with so much better style when you're relaxed and you move better. And it's no different when you're swimming, when you're going through you're going through a race. If you can have that sort of like relaxed feeling and you're focused on your breath and you're just making sure that your heart rate's not up too high, then you will perform so much better as well. And so if you can just transfer that across to all these different areas of life, it really starts to make a difference across the board there.
It's that whole concept of flow, right? And being able to be in the moment, and the breath is really kind of that key. I mean, when in yoga, the thought of the breath is really the bridge between the body and the mind, right? And that whole connection, when it's all working together, that's when everything comes together, right? That's when you feel that effortless movement. That's when you feel those times of just being, the typical sports saying of it, in the zone, right? When you're present. And, there's a great episode. I can't remember who it was that you had on, but I know you did work with them on breathing. And that is something that is huge. And one of the reasons that I think yoga is such an effective practice for swimmers is just how built in the breathing aspect is, because unlike all other sports, we don't get to breathe whenever the heck we want, right? So being comfortable with that aspect and having greater awareness and control of the breath and that connection is so, so important for a swimmer.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good way to use your breathing as well. This is not necessarily a movement thing, but is one of the ways to kind of set your rhythm in your stroke. And I think this is best kind of used when you're training, is set it by your breathing pattern. So for example, this morning with the squad that I was training with, we did a 10-200 set. It's 4 of those at 70%, and then 3 at 75, 2 at 80%, and the last one's at 85%. Now, as I was going through those 10-2s, the way that I sort of focused on my rhythm, or found my rhythm, was through the breathing pattern. So we're in a 50-meter pool, and I was breathing. It was breathing 2, and then 3, 3, 2. So it was like 2, 3, 3, 2. Yeah. So that was for the first first 7 of those 200s, and that way I could keep the heart rate down. I could. And I found my rhythm that way. Now, when I had to pick up the pace, I changed that breathing pattern to, for the first half of it, I'd keep that rhythm for the first 100, and then I switched to breathing every 2 because I needed a little bit more air because I was pushing harder. But just coming back to the breath is a really good way to find your rhythm and get into that state of flow. But if you're just breathing like all over the shop, like 2, 4, 3, 2, like you're probably not going to get into that rhythm and flow. So you've got to find that breathing rhythm first and foremost.
Well, and I mean, even before that point, kind of going back to what you're talking about with the surf is the preparation aspect, right? And when you're preparing to go off on a repeat, or you're preparing for the next set, or in the case of what we're talking about, when you're preparing to get in the water, right? I like to have, when working with athletes before we get in, talk about, we're not only training, what you're thinking typically of your body to be prepared to swim well, but you're warming up your breath, right? You're getting connected in that way, and you're really preparing to use your breath in an effective and efficient way by bringing awareness to it and manipulating it in different ways.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it sounds like, again, it's one of those things where look, you can go fine without doing it, but I've found personally that when I do focus on my breath, or I do focus on moving better, like I swim a hell of a lot better. And so it's these little 1% changes that for me really make a difference. And like this morning as well, like I woke up it was like 4:15. I just woke, no, sorry, 4:30. I woke up, and then so I had about 40 minutes I had to get up and go training. And so woke up, had a coffee, and then I just went through a couple of yoga moves just on the carpet, just to start to warm up. And then I'll grab this here. Those that aren't watching won't be able to see it, but then I just lay on this thing for a couple of minutes. I think it's called a So back, PSO back, or So Right's the company that make them. So, and for me, that just opens me up through my shoulders, and I'm generally pretty tight through there from surfing and swimming. And so just like, yeah, this little routine beforehand. And I haven't swum this well since like February. And so look, a good night's sleep will help, and a couple of other things, but yeah, just doing these little things. And I had a great session. So I'm like, all right, I've got to keep doing that every time.
I mean, it's like you said, right? That 1%, what can you do to just get that little extra advantage? And when we go back to where we started and talking about how tied up adults are after a day, like just doing a couple of movement patterns, a couple of flows to open up through the shoulders, to get some overhead movements going before you actually start in the water. Never mind breath, never mind body, everything we're talking about in this conversation, taking 5 minutes to do that before you actually hit the water, right? That is going to make a huge difference. That's almost, maybe I'm setting a challenge for your listeners right now to do kind of a flow before you get in, and just really do it consistently for a couple of weeks and just see how it changes everything for you in the water, right? And I truly believe that's, physically, mentally, and when it comes to the breath. For me, I mean, I'm going to take it on a coaching end. When I coach a morning practice, for me to be ready to get on deck and perform in the way I want to, and that's, not only mentally, emotionally, but also physically, moving up and down the deck in the speed I want to, how I want to interact with the swimmers. I get up and I do at least half an hour of yoga before I go to a morning practice. So that might mean I'm getting up at 4 rather than 5 a.m. But when I get on deck, when I was coaching a group of master swimmers for a couple of years, I guess right before the pandemic, they used to look at me and go, "What the heck is in your coffee mug, man? And can I get some?" Right. And I was just like, that was all because of the preparation that I was doing, on the mat before I got to the pool. And that got me, like I said, everything from mentally, emotionally, physically, everything prepared to perform at my best. Now that's not in the water, that was out of the water, but the same obviously is going to go for in the water.
Yeah, definitely agree there. And so for you, like where can people find out exactly what you do? And if they're looking at, if they want to get better with their movement, if they want to be a better swimmer through being able to get into better positions, and I can't advocate enough for doing this with what I've seen with all the athletes that I've coached over the last couple of years, is like, I promise you will swim better if you do just some of these routines or some of these exercises on a regular basis. And before we sort of go into where people can find you, Can you just, you don't need to use her name necessarily, but the swimmer that we were talking about before the call, that I had coached before, can you just talk about what her results were, and sort of what she did? Because I think this is a really good sort of testimony to what doing yoga can do for your swimming.
Well, it was interesting. I was telling you, when she first got in touch with me, she basically said, like, I never thought that yoga was going to be a thing for me, and really said flat out that she looked at it with a huge amount of skepticism, and had never enjoyed it in the past, and then was like, you know, I don't got much else to do. It's a pandemic, right? So I'll give it a try. And she came to enjoy it. And then when she got in touch with me about a month ago, after her first swim meet, the first line, I believe, in her email was, "I have proof that swimming specific yoga works." And what she had said is that she went in and she felt kind of bad coming out of the water, because she went in and she was actually making improvements on her times, whereas her teammates were just not feeling great about, never mind time wise, but just how they were moving. And that was, you know, the two biggest things. She was like, I'm coming out of practices, I'm not having the aches and pains I used to have. And then I had the water in my first meet and I'm swimming better than I have before. So, you know, it's amazing to see. For me, having the feedback I've gotten from people who have, you know, come to this through the pandemic and then gotten back in the water, and just giving me the feedback that their bodies are feeling so much better after training, and then being able to get back in the next session and train better. That's a huge thing.
Absolutely. And so where can people find it, and what you've got a sale on your membership at the moment as well, which let people know about?
So the website is swimmingspecificyoga.com, and there I have the online studio. There's a 7-day free trial of the online studio, and the online studio has over 100 classes that range anywhere from 10 to 60 minutes in length. And so that's one access point. And then I also have a YouTube channel where you can experience some of the practices there as well. And the YouTube channel is also Swimming Specific Yoga. And then the sale coming up is going to be a half price on our annual membership. So, excuse me, that price is going to be $59.99 for unlimited access to the online studio for a year. And there's going to be a few different bonus products in there as well.
Fantastic. So we'll put the links in the show notes. And look, if after 7 days, if you're finding no benefit, then feel free to cancel. But I would be surprised if you found no benefit at all after 7 days. So yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. And I wouldn't have you on the show if I didn't think that what you teach is worthwhile and helpful to the people that listen to this show. And yeah, we've known each other for a number of years, and it's funny how our kind of worlds have collided, I guess, with the swimmer that you just mentioned. And I'm sure there's probably quite a few more as well, because one of the funny things about having a podcast is, like, you just don't know who's listening. And it's like, we can talk, and I hope someone listens to this. That would be nice. But the amount of people that I've had who have come up to me and say, I listen to your podcast and I really like it. And like, just people that I've met at pools and stuff. It's like, that's really cool that, that so many people do listen to it. So I hope that this can really change someone's swimming, and not only just their swimming, but also, if you move better in swimming, you're going to move better in day-to-day life, and maybe get through those aches and pains and a whole bunch of other things. So it is a worthwhile thing to do, because there's nothing worse than getting older and just getting worse posture. And you see it with people, but if you can move well, look, you are going to defy age as you get older.
But I was going to say two things. One, please, I'm very open to correspondence. Send me an email if you have any questions on anything at all, and that's swimmingspecificyoga@gmail.com. And then I was going to share just a quick story with you. That master's group that I taught out here in Vancouver, I had one of the swimmers come in the morning, and this was an Irish guy, and he comes over. He goes, "Jeff, I just got an email from one of my mates in Ireland," and it pulls up your podcast with me on it. And I'm like, that is hilarious.
That's so cool. Yeah, it's it's very cool to be able to do this, and I'm sure people will benefit from it. So Jeff, thanks again for being on the podcast, and and I appreciate and all the best with what you've got coming up that we spoke about before the call, and I appreciate it.